You feel it before you see it, a shadow falling across a doorway, and inside, someone is already reaching for the vinegar, scrubbing the stone threshold like it's been poisoned. Somewhere nearby, a housewife who saw that shadow pass will scald her own doorstep with boiling water before she lets her children walk over it again. That shadow belongs to the executioner. In parts of medieval Germany, that's what people believed his presence could do to a home he never even entered. And yet this same man, the one whose shadow was treated like a contamination, was the only person in town the law trusted enough to carry out its final sentence. By the end of this video, you'll understand how the person a medieval town depended on most was also the person it worked hardest to erase. And you'll see why that contradiction still says something uncomfortable about how we treat people today. You probably picture this man as powerful. Feared, yes, but feared the way a king or a soldier is feared. Respected, given space, maybe even a little admired for the authority he carries. The truth is nearly the opposite. He was one of the most despised, most isolated people in the entire town. Power wasn't the word for what he had. Isolation was. So let's start with the thing that made him untouchable, in the most literal sense. In many medieval European regions, executioners were treated as social pariahs, and the taboos around them went far beyond simple dislike. His touch was considered contaminating. In some places, so was his shadow, his presence, even the tools he'd handled. This wasn't some fringe superstition whispered by a few nervous villagers. It shaped real legal restrictions and social customs across multiple countries. In parts of Germany, the term for it was written plainly into law and custom. Unehrlich, dishonorable. A formal category, not a rumor. Guild membership could be denied. Church seating could be restricted. The executioner's family pushed to a separate pew, sometimes to the very back, sometimes barred from communion alongside honorable townsfolk. In some towns, the label attached to his trade was written into law as unclean or dishonorable, a formal category with real consequences, including in some jurisdictions, being unable to testify in court or serve as a legal witness to a contract. The very machinery of justice he served wouldn't fully recognize him within it. He wasn't just disliked. He was legally and socially marked as something other than a normal citizen, while still being the one person the court called on to enforce its judgments. So if everyone feared and avoided this man, here's the question worth sitting with. How did anyone become one in the first place? Nobody was lining up for this job. That answer is stranger and sadder than you'd expect. Executioner was, first and foremost, a necessary civic role. Every town with a court needed someone to physically carry out its sentences, hangings, beheadings, floggings, brandings, and in many places, the same man was also responsible for administering torture during interrogation, applying the rack, the strappado, or hot irons under a magistrate's orders before ever touching the rope or the blade. The law demanded it. But because of the stigma wrapped around the job, almost nobody volunteered. Few free men chose it. So towns did what desperate systems often do. They made it hereditary. Not officially, in most places, but practically. Sons of executioners found that no guild would take them. No other trade would apprentice them. No respectable family wanted them nearby. The job that made their father untouchable was often the only job left open to them. Think about what that actually means. A boy born into this family hadn't broken a single law. He hadn't touched a rope or a blade, and yet the town had already decided what he was before he'd had any say in it, before he'd done anything at all. The stigma wasn't a punishment for conduct. It was a punishment for birth. And that's the part of this story that starts to feel less like medieval history and more like something you recognize. You'd think a family already this isolated would at least be left to live quietly, out of sight, out of mind. Instead, the exclusion followed them into the most ordinary corners of daily life. Executioner families were largely shut out of normal town social life, clubs, taverns, respectable company, and in many regions marriage prospects narrowed down to almost nothing except other executioner families, or families in similarly dishonorable trades like skinners, grave diggers, or knackers. Entire bloodlines of the excluded, marrying only each other, generation after generation, because the honorable families of the town wouldn't have them. Dynasties built not out of ambition, but out of having nowhere else left to turn. But here's where it gets stranger than you'd expect. This wasn't just about weddings and dinner invitations. It reached all the way down into buying bread. In some regions, executioners couldn't freely enter markets or shops the way an ordinary townsperson could. Everyday transactions, the most mundane part of human life, required workarounds specifically designed to avoid direct contact with him. A coin left on a counter instead of handed over. A purchase made through an intermediary. In some documented accounts, merchants used tongs to lift the coins he'd touched, or drop them straight into a bowl of water or vinegar before they'd count them as clean again. The exchange itself was treated as tainted, as though his money carried the same contamination as his shadow. This wasn't written into law in every town. It was custom, habit, a documented pattern of exclusion enforced not by judges, but by neighbors. And customs like that are often harder to escape than laws, because there's no court to appeal to. There's just everyone, quietly agreeing to keep their distance. So where did a family this unwelcome even live? Not among everyone else. In many towns, executioners and their families were pushed to live on the physical outskirts, at the edge of the settlement, sometimes near the very gallows they operated, sometimes near the tanneries and other so-called unclean trades the town kept at arm's length, in low houses set apart by a lane or a wall that everyone understood without needing a sign to explain it. This wasn't incidental. It mirrored exactly where other impure occupations were placed, reinforcing block by block, street by street, the idea that this family was something to be contained. Geography became a daily, visible reminder of what the town had decided about them, long before any of them had earned it or deserved it. But being pushed to the margins wasn't even the most dangerous part of the job. The work itself could kill you too. Not metaphorically, but directly. Executions required real precision. A clean beheading demanded skill with a blade, timing, steady hands, and nerve. A single stroke, delivered under the eyes of an entire crowd that had often walked for hours to watch. A botched job wasn't just an embarrassment. It could turn a hostile crowd violent, and that violence didn't always stay aimed at the condemned. Executioners have been recorded facing the fury of onlookers when an execution went wrong, when suffering dragged on longer than the crowd could stomach, when the mercy of a quick death failed to arrive. This was a job that demanded genuine expertise that could mean the difference between a controlled event and a riot. And yet none of that skill bought the executioner any social credit. He could be the most competent man in the region at his trade, and it changed nothing about how the town saw him the next morning at the market he could barely enter. One of the clearest windows into this life comes from Nuremberg, from a man named Meister Frantz Schmidt, who served as the city's executioner for roughly 45 years, from 1573 into the early 1600s. Schmidt kept a journal across his career, a rare surviving document, recording each execution he carried out, by his own count 361 of them, along with the crimes, the methods, and at times his own private judgment on whether the sentence was just. That diary is one of the few places history lets you see the job from the inside, methodical, literate, precise, and still, by the law of his own city, unehrlich, dishonorable, the same label attached to every executioner's son, born with no say in the matter. You'd expect a man risking his life and his nerve for the town's sake to at least be trusted for it. Instead, trust was the one thing he could never earn back, no matter how many times he did the job well. Which raises a harder question. What did this actually do to the people living it? Historical accounts and later reflection on executioners raise real, documented questions about the psychological weight of the role, the guilt, the isolation, the toll of being the hand that carried out the state's violence while being treated as the source of it. Some executioners are recorded seeking other ways to be seen, through charity, through piety, through second trades practiced quietly on the side, anything that might soften the label. Notably, because the job required real anatomical knowledge, how bodies broke, how joints set, how flesh healed, some executioners, Schmidt reportedly among them, were quietly sought out as folk healers and bone setters, trusted with the same hands the town wouldn't shake in daylight. None of it fully worked. The job was the identity the town had already assigned, and identities assigned by a whole community are almost impossible for one person to argue away. If the idea of an entire family inherited into a label they never chose unsettles you, stay close, because the next role we cover shows that same trap working in the opposite direction. A job that looked like power on the surface and was really just another kind of cage. So why would anyone stay in a role that cost this much? Because for most executioner families, there was no realistic way out. Other professions were closed. Guilds wouldn't admit them. Neighboring towns knew the family name and treated it the same way their hometown did. The stigma didn't travel with paperwork. It traveled with reputation, and reputation followed a surname for generations. This is the core cruelty sitting underneath the whole story. Punishment for something you didn't do, delivered for simply being born into the wrong family, in the wrong town, doing the one job everyone needed and nobody would forgive. And that's the part of this story that isn't really about the medieval world at all. You've probably felt some smaller version of this yourself, reduced to one job, one label, one assumption, before anyone bothered to look past it. Maybe it was a mistake that followed you longer than it should have. Maybe it was a role people decided to find you, without asking who you actually were underneath it. The executioner's story isn't really about swords or scaffolds, in the end. It's about what happens when a society decides who you are before you ever get a say in it, and how little that judgment has to do with your actual character. This wasn't fiction. This was somebody's whole life. Cursed roles.